understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
Hey, it's John here, and today we continue our special series of unique conversations recorded at the Dalkey Book Festival. Now, Max sat down with Katja Hoyer, who argues that amid oppression and frequent hardship, East Germany was home to a rich political, social and cultural landscape, a place far more dynamic than the Cold War caricature that is often painted in the West. Entitled Beyond the Wall, Life in the GDR, this is a really fascinating conversation.
Katja, it's lovely to have you here. The book is fantastic. I loved it from start to finish. I love your approach to history, but give us a sense of the young Katja Hoyer, where she was born, what that state felt like. I know you were very young at the time, but tell me exactly where in the DDR you were born.
So I was born in 1985, so I was really quite a young, child. Well, I was 4 years old when the Berlin Wall fell, 5 years old when Germany reunified. And so my memories of the actual state are quite hazy in that respect, and that was indeed one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book. This was me as an adult, as a historian, sort of going back, if you will, to a country that I was from but didn't know much about. It's a very strange situation to look at your birth certificate and see a country there that isn't on the map anymore. Even during COVID, when I got my COVID vaccination, I took my little vaccination passport to the NHS in the UK and said, can you put the stamp in there? And it still had the East German emblem, obviously, on the front, because I've always had it. So it's an odd thing, really, to be from somewhere that isn't there anymore. And that was kind of my main, or is still my main relationship to that state. And I was also born in a city that at the time was called Wilhelmpieckstadt, Guben.
Ooh. That's after the main man.
After the main man, after the first and only president of the GDR. So that's what it still says today in my British passport. I've lived in the UK for over a decade now, and it's just, kind of a document that has my life summed up in a way.
What's the town called now?
It's still called Guben, but just Guben without the Wilhelmpieckstadt.
So it would be kind of like De Valera-ville or something here, which would be kind of weird. And where exactly in East Germany is that?
So that's right on the German-Polish border. It's one of those cities that was divided when, after the Second World War, Germany lost a lot of territory in the east, and the Oder and the Neisse rivers were used as the new dividing line between Germany and Poland. And Guben is one of those places that had the river Neisse sort of flow right through it. So the nicer kind of old town part ended up on the Polish side and is today called Gubin. Mm-hmm. And the sort of newer part with most of the industry and things like that was on the German side and called Guben. So it's an interesting place to be from, again, which has changed a lot in recent years.
But it's a good place to start with this population transfer in 1945. It's a good place because your book it deals with who ended up living in East Germany, who had even before the state was formed. So it was obviously the local people from the area, but a huge amount of German refugees.
Yeah, and I think that's an aspect of European history that isn't really on people's radar, because Germany obviously, it's a very sensitive subject. The fact that so many people who are currently in Germany are the descendants of people who didn't live in what is Germany now. So these territories to the east, that's Poland mostly today, but also what is Kaliningrad now and was Königsberg at the time in East Prussia. My own family, a lot of them are from there. So I've got 3 of my 4 grandparents are kind of from these territories, from East Prussia and from what was the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia and so on. And within East Germany, they made up sort of between a fifth and a quarter of the population.
Wow,
which is
that's a lot.
That is a lot. And I mean, people don't really understand, I think, how much upheaval that caused at the time. I mean, these people came with nothing, literally with the clothes that they were wearing, often after months or sometimes years of kind of traveling from where they were from to what then became Germany, and arrived often with no kind of familial links or jobs or anything like that. And it just added a layer of complexity when you build up a new state, and people not only don't feel affiliated with the state because it's brand new, but also with even the locality where they now live.
So as the Red Army pushed the German armies back, these people ran, in effect?
Yeah, some of them did. And then afterwards, because it was decided that basically, as they said at the time, there was to be a humane expulsion of kind of what people called ethnic Germans from those areas, because after the First World War, you had a situation where Poland had to be created as a new state, and then suddenly you had millions of Germans living in Poland, not in Germany anymore. That was part of the reason why Hitler came to power, how he was able to use that as a sort of means to say these people need to come back into the Reich. And so to avoid these ethnic tensions, after the Second World War, the decision was made to expel 12 to 14 million Germans from
Such
that
a
area.
huge amount of people.
It is huge, and it isn't something, as I say, that's very much talked about because of the ongoing sort of political tensions with that. I often say when Poland is asking for reparations now to the tune of several hundred trillion of euros, for the Second World War, and I often say it's a very dangerous debate to start that again, because ultimately that will lead to Germans saying, well, hang on a minute, we gave you some land here, so where does that sit? And instantly you open that can of worms again, which is why people tend not to do that and talk about it.
So before we go to the GDR, the state, the book, I just thought, was this part of your familial conversation? Was there a sort of in Germany you've got this expression Heimweh, the idea that you're yearning from a different home. Was it talked about, or was it just brushed under the carpet?
It wasn't until the sort of late 90s, and that seems to be a common story. So you hear that a lot, that people's sort of grandparents suddenly started talking about this sort of 10, 15 years after the GDR collapsed, because for one thing, the GDR itself wasn't keen on making that a big thing, because they had to ultimately get on with the Soviet Union, which got the eastern part of what was Poland, which is why Poland was kind of shifted to the west. So that wasn't a topic that people were sort of allowed to talk about or form kind of parties or sort of, I don't know, like clubs and things about. And then once the Berlin Wall fell and people could start talking about this, it became more of a thing. And then suddenly my grandfather started talking about it as well. But previously it wasn't, because he was from sort of an area just outside of Königsberg, in the far east, basically, in Prussia, East Prussia. And initially it was very much a cultural thing. So for instance, my grandmother, his wife, who was actually from Saxony, right, kind of within what was then East Germany, had to learn how to cook Königsberger Klopse, so Königsberg meatballs.
You get those wrong.
So that he can carry on eating what he was used to from his childhood. But it was more, it had sort of that dimension, and suddenly he started talking about some of the horrific things that actually happened on the journey. Like, for instance, his younger sister died of, I think it was typhoid, along the way, which is something that nobody knew about up until he was very old and started talking about it in the 90s. So I think that's quite a familiar story, that people kind of just suppress these memories because they had to on the one hand side, but also because they didn't really want to talk about it. Many people wanted to have a new start, a fresh start in East Germany.
In East Germany. And before we talk about East Germany, what is fascinating now is the extent to which East Germany is still really different from West Germany. I was looking at some statistics from the getting married at a certain younger, having kids younger, income per head being lower, wealth per head being lower, the size of the farms being lower, like these three basic things. And of course, the now voting pretty much overwhelmingly for the alternative for Deutschland. Right? It's as if after 30 years of unification, East Germany is still there.
It appears.
And this is what I want to
to
discuss with you, but it hasn't really. I mean, the people are different.
Yeah, no, they are. I mean, it's even if you look at any statistic, really. I think part of what you shared on social media was things like the amount of tennis courts.
Yes.
And
there's
just
none
really
in East Germany.
There's very few in East Germany. Yeah, so it's or you could look at things like, for instance, East Germans are more likely to shake someone's hand when they introduce themselves, whilst West Germans kind of tend to walk into a room and just say hello into the room rather than shaking people's hands. Is virtually kind of any metric that you look at, and you'll see the old sort of East-West divisions reappear. And I think the problem with that is that over the last sort of 35 years or so, the assumption has always been that the way that West Germans do things is normal, because East Germans kind of joined. And then the pressure was there, whether explicitly or implicitly, to kind of adapt to that and not be strange or weird.
Yeah.
And people will tell you when you talk to them about their experiences in the early 90s, many people will tell you just how awkward they felt, being put in a position quite often. If you traveled west, for example, then you were kind of the outlier and doing things in a weird way. How humiliated they were often by that experience. So one thing that lots of people talk about is the idea that they didn't have shopping trolleys in
East
Germany. So suddenly you had to sort of know, that you had to put a coin in there, how to put them back. Some people were trying to push them like through the turnstile thing that you still had back in the day. And, it's just embarrassing, really. And you're told kind of, oh, these things were all normal, when people in the West sort of grew up with them. But they're not normal. They're just the way that you do things over there. And that acceptance that, people just are different hasn't quite sunk in yet. So you get phrases like East Germans haven't arrived yet, and this kind of language is constantly used. And I think that's part of the reason why there's so much upset in the East about various things.
I mean, because the upset is, it's palpable now, And yet, on the other hand, before we go into the history, Angela Merkel was probably the biggest export from the East.
Yep.
She was a pure DDR girl.
Yeah, but again, she was extremely conscious of that and tried to not make a big thing out of it. So it was quite astonishing that in her sort of last big speech in office, which was in 2021 on German Unity Day, on the 3rd of October, that was the first time she explicitly, this is right at the end of her chancellorship after 16 years, she explicitly talked about the way that made her feel. I actually start the book with her as an example.
It's a song that she quotes, isn't it?
Yeah, and she also says basically even a foundation that was trying to praise her, this is a foundation very close to her own political party, said that despite the ballast of her East German past, she did quite well in politics. She's like, what do you mean the ballast of my... That was literally the half of her life. She spent 35 years in the East and now 35 years sort of in reunified Germany. And what she said is to just brush this off as like this sort of burden, supposedly, that was kind of on her, and she was supposed to just shrug it off and be normal finally and be free. That riled her, but she never talked about it and tried to not make it too obvious, in the way that she behaved and spoke and so on, that she was from the East, which is also why she was seen quite critically in lots of places in the East. Because
she had to shake it off to be a German leader.
Yeah, and people felt like she'd sort of left that area behind her and didn't really make enough of an effort to try and, deal with some of the issues that are still around.
So let's go back to the East, to the foundation of the state, because what is lovely, and I think about the book, is the sense in which you kind of reimagine this country. Because after the wall came down, there was The Lives of Others, that movie about the Stasi, then there was Stasi-land, and the entire country was kind of dismissed as this police state when there was nothing going on. And yet what you bring to life is the actual explicit, unique culture of the East that came up. But let's go back to the very, very start. So the leaders of East Germany are by and large German communists who fled Hitler. Is that the case?
Yep.
Tell me about these people.
Yeah, so I spent quite a bit of time with these people in the book, despite the fact that it says it starts in 1949. I cheat a bit, and there's a whole big chapter before that, because I think it's really important that that's understood, because quite often, we think of sort of dictators as kind of tin pot dictators. They're dictators because they're kind of evil people and they just want to suppress the population. And of course, there's a lot to that, but the point is still that you need to understand why they did what they did in order to understand the state. And with them, it's interesting because a lot of them had been communists literally for decades. Before the First World War, a lot of them, even like Walter Ulbricht is a classic example, the first leader of the GDR. And they then fled to the Soviet Union when Hitler came into power for two reasons, mainly to escape Hitler, of course, in the first place, but also find a way of fighting back. So rather than keeping your head down and staying in the country, they figured sort of going to the Soviet Union, to the only socialist or communist state that was around at that time in the world, was an opportunity to build up that sort of system. And what they found wasn't the paradise that they'd been dreaming of, but complete and utter Stalinist, paranoia. This is at the height of the Stalinist purges in the 1930s, where he's virtually looking around even at his own people within the army and elsewhere, killing, lots of people even within the Soviet Union itself. And then suddenly tens of thousands of Germans arrive, and they say they're German communists, but from Stalin's point of view, who knows?
They're just Germans.
They're just Germans. And a lot of them had sat in German concentration camps and were incarcerated and then let go, because the Nazis thought, you just treat them extremely badly there and then they'll either keep their head down or leave the country. And they were then in the Soviet Union with that history, and Stalin was looking at that thinking, well, who knows what deal they made, you know, to be released. And so the idea was that they're all kind of fifth columnists and need to be dealt with. And then Stalin issues the so-called German order, which virtually targeted all Germans in the country, not even just the communists, but also the ethnic Germans that had been living there.
And there were many ethnic Germans
There were many there, yeah, since Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, they'd both kind of got them over as architects and people to build up a sort of more Western Russia. So they'd been there for centuries, and because they still spoke German or had German names or German ancestry, they were also targeted. And so effectively 3/4 of all the German communists that went to the Soviet Union, as I say, we're talking tens of thousands of people here, weren't alive anymore at the end of the Second World War. They were killed by Stalin. They were either killed outright, or they were put into the Gulag system and sort of perished there, or kind of, you know, targeted by local communities once that order was sort of put out there, where quite often they had conflicts anyway because they were earning more money and doing largely better than the local population. And that also applies to the elite. So you had 9 members of the German communists sort of Politburo going to the Soviet Union. Only 2 of them were still alive. Wow. At the end of the Second World War, and that's Walter Ulbricht and Wilhelm Pieck, so the first 2 leaders of the GDR. And all of that context is important, not because, you know, you want to create some sort of sense of pity for these people, but the sense of persecution that they'd undergone, the fact that they weren't just targeted by their own government in Germany, but then also by the Soviet regime. And on top of that, they were all grassing each other up to survive. You know, so exactly. You literally had people saying, well, I'm not sure about this person. They could just be a sort of, you know, red-coated fascist, as the term had it, in order to survive themselves and sort of prove to Stalin that they were entirely loyal. And that experience, to me, is important if you want to understand why they were suspicious, you know, when they came back to Germany, about absolutely everyone, including their own kind of comrades and the population. And that then explains why, for instance, the Stasi had this kind of ridiculous inclination to observe and monitor absolutely everyone in the country. And even when there weren't any uprisings between, you know, you have remarkable stability really between a mass uprising in 1953 and then the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89. Between that, you don't see any mass-scale resistance or kind of, like kind of mass demonstrations or anything like that. Despite that, there's never the trust there that the people might actually just kind of get on with their lives and actually work within the state, because they don't trust each other, never mind the German population.
So the essential DNA of the leaders is one of extreme paranoia. And then they come to this country. So the Soviets occupy this part of Germany. And again, what you reiterate, it's a small place. It's 18 million vis-a-vis West Germany, which is, 60 million. So it's a very small part. Huge amount of refugees in the country, and a disproportionate amount of young women raped, much more so than in West Germany. So you're talking, I mean, there was mass rape of German women. So you're talking about a very traumatized society that emerges after the Second World War, with this leadership on top of them. Okay. And yet, it manages to survive. This is the extraordinary thing. You know, for the first couple of years, it's kind of touch and go as to whether it'll survive. Yeah. So explain to me what's happening in the 1950s. You know, you have the uprising, I think, in 53, is it?
Yep.
Explain that period, because that's where it's at its most fragile, in a way.
And it is an interesting fact that, again, people don't really think about a lot, that this existential fear, you know, comes on top of the paranoia that we just talked about. So the leaders are never...
normal. You're really normal.
Well, I wasn't born at the time, so I mean, that's the thing.
Talking about your parents and things.
Yeah, but that's the thing as well. You know, by the 1980s, you had a population who thought that a stable, sort of relatively stable socialist system was sort of semi-functioning. And thereby they are very different from the leaders who are still at the helm. And I think that causes some of the conflicts later on, which I'm sure we'll get to. But in the 1950s, the regime really was afraid that the state might not survive, because you had not only, obviously, the West pushing and saying Germany should be reunified. The German people themselves didn't want their country split, neither East nor West, obviously deeply unpopular. And you had the Soviets kind of constantly saying, you know, if we need to trade you in for things, we will do. You know, there's quite some of the Soviet leadership in the book as well, where, you know, it's kind of, what is this GDR anyway? It only exists because we hold it up. And there's a really deep sensitivity towards that, particularly after the uprising in 1953, which the Soviets squashed, not the East German state itself, because they have...
What exactly happened then? So tell me what happened in 53.
So I think the main reason for there's a mass uprising of about 1 million people, and as you say, it's a small country, so 1 million people on the streets everywhere across East Germany. It's a huge people's uprising in the actual sense of the word. And what happened is that in 1949, when the state was founded, there were still a lot of people who found the idea that you can kind of create a new Germany, something that's different from the militarism and from the fascism that had come before, quite attractive. So you even get some people, intellectuals in particular, moving there because they find that idea of a brand new Germany attractive. And when that doesn't kind of realize itself and it's not what they thought it would be, you get an increasing amount of sort of hostility towards not just the dictatorial nature of the regime, but also the fact that economically it's not working out. Because they're paying huge amounts of reparations. The West doesn't take any, stops very quickly taking reparations. So almost all of the war reparations for the Second World War that Germany paid was paid by East Germany.
I think that's a really important point to make, and I hadn't thought about that the Russians basically robbed everything. Everything. Everything that could be taken back to Russia was taken, whereas in West Germany, we gave Marshall aid. Well, we didn't.
I was going to say,
the Americans,
you got some, didn't
we
you?
we didn't even get. We were so dumb we didn't even get Marshall aid.
Oh, did you not?
No,
Okay,
the Yanks said, "Do you want it?" We said, "No, we don't want that. No, we're fine. We've loads of cash here. Don't be worried." But so the West pumped enormous amounts of technology and money into West Germany, at the same time as the Russians are robbing everything from East Germany. So again, the fragility of the state is, I mean, it is, again, as I say, touch and go as to whether this place will survive.
Yeah, absolutely. And because of this economic situation in the West, you get the so-called economic miracle in the 1950s. So there's West Germans kind of, taking part in things like, American culture, effectively. So there's like scooter clubs and Elvis clubs and, people getting their toothpaste in piece quality again, and then rationing being abolished very quickly, actually earlier than in lots of other Western European countries. I don't know specifically about Ireland, but in the UK, it carried on a lot longer than it did in West Germany. And people
it was here about 1998, it stopped. We can still remember it, queuing up for toothpaste.
Yeah, so, and obviously with it being sort of one nation, one country, East Germans, and the wall isn't there yet. People also forget that it's only built in 1961, so up until then, people can still go back and forth between the two Germanys. So there's a very obvious kind of comparison there where East Germans look at West Germany and say, why are they getting on better than we are? And at the same time, East Germans are being made to work harder and harder. The work ratios, in a centralized economy are being upped and up all the time. And so people come home, after like a 14-hour shift in the factory with nothing to buy on the shelves and not really a means of picking their lives back up. And that leads to huge amounts of frustration because the regime doesn't accept that is the case. I mean, there's one scene that I describe in the book where this uprising starts on the 16th of June, 1953. And there's workers of all people, in this workers' paradise. Workers on the Stalinallee in Berlin, again of all places, sort of putting literally their tools down and walking towards the sort of official state building and asking for Walter Ulbricht to come out to speak to them. And he doesn't. He just sits on the inside and he looks out of his window and goes, oh, look, it's beginning to rain. I'm sure these people are going to disperse very soon. And obviously they weren't really bothered about the weather, but they were very angry and hungry and desperate. And that sort of, again, this gulf between the people and their leaders, shows there very obviously, and it frustrates people. And so they start basically, with the help of Western radio stations and other means, kind of to coordinate this uprising for the next day. And it happens across Germany, and the Soviets come in and crush it. And that is a moment that makes the regime realize just how fragile this whole thing is.
And how dependent they are on Moscow.
Yeah, and how Moscow immediately says to them, get your act together, sort this out. I mean, when the Soviets tell you to tone down your communism a little bit, you just know you've probably overdone it. So, at that moment, they realize they kind of have to work with the population to a degree, even though obviously the Stasi and the sort of observation never goes away. But it also means the regime stays throughout this entire time acutely aware of even the smallest amount of grumbling that is going on. That's actually one of the tasks that the Stasi has, ironically, is to work out, what are people grumbling about in the pubs and in their workplaces and at home, so that they can feed this back to the regime, and the regime can then go, oh, maybe we need to do something about this. And it is quite, I have some examples in the book. Coffee is a classic example.
Come on,
jeans.
Tell us.
So coffee, I put that example in there because it just goes to show just how desperate they were to keep people happy. So there's a worldwide coffee shortage in the 70s, which is also felt in the West, with higher sort of coffee prices. But the GDR having to import coffee from all over the world means that it's getting so expensive that they can't afford to import the coffee anymore. And so the initial response is then we just make our own horrid ersatz coffee mix, and that's what they did. So they put like chicory powder and other things and made this sort of 50-50 coffee mix, and people absolutely hated it. It was called Erich's Krönung, Eric's Brew, after Erich Honecker, the leader, and people just hated it. And I think just to, it seems a small thing, but when you think, I often compare it in the UK to if you said the next day, there was no more tea, people would freak out.
Yeah, they would freak out.
And that's pretty much the case with coffee in Germany. It's a thing that tells you whatever else is going on, you can kind of have a cup of coffee and have that moment in your day, and it's just an important ritual to people. And when people start seriously grumbling about the fact that there's no proper coffee anymore, the Stasi takes that very seriously, and so does the regime. And so they look around in the world and think to themselves, well, where can we grow coffee, but we don't have to then buy it with hard currency, we can maybe trade it for something else, so it needs to be within the socialist sphere. And in the 70s, the obvious place is Vietnam. So the Americans had just withdrawn in 1975. A country was absolutely war damaged, needed to be built up basically again. And so the GDR exported entire irrigation systems, botanical experts, sort of replanted entire societies in Vietnam from the coastline where most people lived in sort of fishing villages into the highlands where you can grow the coffee. It was a huge undertaking. And the idea was basically that then they would get 50% of the coffee that comes out of that project for themselves to use, and the other side Vietnam can use. It was genuinely a development project as well, to a degree. And it worked brilliantly. I mean, today Vietnam is the second largest coffee producer in the world. Courtesy of the GDR. Most instant coffee is kind of, the granular coffee is sort of produced in Vietnam today still. But the problem is that coffee crops take sort of about 10 to 15 years to grow, and the first harvest came in 1991. so that didn't really benefit the GDR anymore. But the point of this great story is not just that it's a great story, but it just goes to show just how much effort was put into
to just keep everything on the
keep people reasonably pacified and keep them sort of happy enough so that they wouldn't cause another uprising like '53.
Well, I suppose the one big event that most non-Germans will be aware of and will know about is the Berlin Wall. So how does that come about? How, the state is functioning, it's getting on with itself, the education system is working, things are working. How does the Berlin Wall come about? What's the background to this?
So things are working, but they always feel like 4, 5, 6, 7 steps behind what's happening in West Germany, effectively. And by its definition, if you're trying to build a socialist state, and you're kind of creating this classless society, you are going to have middle and upper class people who lose out if everyone gets leveled. Yeah. So, imagine a school and the head teacher gets the same as the cleaner. The head teacher might think to himself or herself, I'm just going to go west where I've got more prestige and more money basically coming in, and that's effectively what happened. So you get this massive brain drain from East Germany to West Germany in the 1950s when the border in Berlin is still open. So the GDR eventually, in 1953, it closes the inner German, the long border. People sometimes forget, even though it's an obvious thing, sometimes forget that, the Berlin Wall is in Berlin, and then you still have that long so-called green border, basically, between the two Germanys. Stalin has that closed in 1952 because the West is beginning to rearm and Stalin is beginning to panic that there might be another German Western kind of launch onto the Soviet Union. So that's closed, but people can still go to East Berlin, walk over the sector borders, and then take a train out from West Berlin to the rest of West Germany. And that happens, people go in their droves. So as you say, the system starts off with sort of 18, 19 million And then you have sort of over 2 million people flee in that time and kind of go westwards. So it's massive, and particularly in the medical sector, because that's the sort of biggest area where people can make a lot more money in West Germany than they can in the East. You get doctors, nurses, medical personnel basically fleeing en masse, and the entire medical system sort of threatens to break down. So eventually, Walter Ulbricht is able to go to the Soviets and convince them that the wall should be built in Berlin to kind of close that gap and stabilize the GDR accordingly. The Soviets initially weren't overly keen, because people, again, often forget that when we're talking about the wall being built in 1961, that's 1 year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, just to give you an idea of how tense the situation was. And for the Soviets to sit there and say this kind of occupied city, which Berlin still was, it was still run by the four Allies, it didn't belong to any of the Germanys in theory. For there to be a change right there, at any moment that could have escalated, one soldier firing on another, or even the change in the status of Berlin basically causing the Third World War effectively, in this time with nuclear weapons. So they didn't take that decision lightly, and it was taken in with the view of kind of stabilizing the GDR, really, because it wasn't functional anymore at that point. And then in the 1960s, once it's built in 1961, I really struggled writing that chapter, because you get two completely different stories depending on who you ask. So there are all of these horrific stories, of which I tell many in the book as well, obviously, of families being torn apart, of people who worked in West Berlin but lived in East Berlin, of people studying in one part of the city but living in another. Their lives were deeply disturbed by this, and also obviously families couldn't see each other anymore. People died, were shot at the Berlin Wall, so all of these stories are there. But ask somebody who doesn't have anything to do with that, who sort of lives in, Dresden or as I say, like Guben by the Polish border or whatever, they quite often, when I interviewed them, say things like, I only found out days later that the Berlin Wall had gone up because I was on holiday. It was in the summer, in August 1961. I took note of it, but it didn't really affect me. And these people will then quite often tell you that the 1960s, because the wall was closed, kind of stabilized the system, and it began to
that comes out in the book, the idea that the wall was a stabilization mechanism for the East.
So what you do with that, you've got this kind of deep injustice on the one side, and then sort of millions of people telling you that actually life got better for them afterwards. And I think the tendency in Germany has been to dismiss the latter story because the former seems more morally relevant. And so that, to me, didn't seem right either, because you're kind of just burying these people's, stories and what actually life felt like for the majority of East Germans at the time. And that leads to this kind of idea of the East being some sort of open-air prison, where everyone was desperate to leave, when actually we're talking about a small minority. Most people were at home where they were, and they wouldn't have left, even if it had been completely horrible. I basically, what I ended up doing is putting these stories side by side. They're just in the book alongside each other in the 1960s chapter.
That's what the book does for me so well, because I had basically been a recipient of the incessant anti-GDR propaganda that we got here all the time. An open-air prison, the Stasi, people are watching each other, all that. And what you do is you give voice and give life to a culture that is emerging despite all this, and is very vibrant, and is actually quite proud of itself and quite happy with what's going on. I want to get to this point where we are now, which is the permanence of the psychological gap between East Germans and West Germans. But I want to get there through the 70s. You mentioned what people noticed in the late 80s about East Germans when they came over the wall was the extraordinary abundance of denim.
That is true. You could always tell if somebody was from the East, they were doing the whole thing.
It's double denim, double onesies. Tell me, but you tell that story, now you explain to me why that was. So tell me the story.
Yes, I think, the thing with denim is, and with jeans in general, they also in the West in the 60s were a bit of a rebellious thing to wear. They were still seen as very casual, very American. You certainly wouldn't have gone to your workplace in them basically as a young person, maybe as a rebellious thing, but you would have been, quite out there doing that. So I think it always had that little bit of a rebelliousness about it. But then the fact that you couldn't just get hold of one in the East, because obviously they were American, especially as people wanted the original Levi's, that was kind of the crowning glory if you had one of those. So they became, I think, a bit of a sort of symbol for the kind of consumerism that people lacked. You know, people wanted these things. They were very difficult to get hold of. You needed Western relatives to send them over to you. And then if you had one of these treasured jeans, they were kind of kept for years. People looked after them, you know, and wore them. But also, you know, they were a bit of a sort of status symbol in lots of ways as well. And the regime realized the potential of that and thought, you know, here's something, especially once Honecker had come in 1971 as a general secretary and wanted to show that here's a new generation of leader. He was a generation younger than Ulbricht. You know, he wanted to be the leader of the young, of the people. And so he basically decided not only to build up a jeans industry in the GDR, where they had Western-sounding sort of names like Boxer, and bison, which is sort of the European, you know, sort of European version of the American buffalo, if you will. So there was that sort of idea behind that. And the problem was, as ever, they needed the cotton from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was like, well, we need cotton for things, so you can have what we find on the factory floor and then do something with that. So that meant the jeans that were produced in the GDR weren't, in terms of their quality, you know, comparable to what you got in the West. And again, Honecker realized that also what people wanted was really a slice of America. And so he actually went to Levi Strauss in the US, to the company, and said to them, we need to import some jeans, can you make us a deal? And they imported 1 million for a population of 16 million, 1 million pairs.
They imported 1 million pairs of Levi's
jeans at
things
huge
they
expense.
went to preserve socialism. Yeah. This is all to preserve communism.
Ironically, importing a bit of American sort of Westernism and consumerism.
So 1 million pairs of jeans are imported?
Yeah, there was an absolute frenzy. I mean, they were put out in the shops, and, you know, you got, the reports are really funny because you've got these sort of stiff, you know, Stasi reports in sort of proper, you know, bureaucratic German, telling you about this frenzy, how there weren't enough changing rooms, so people tried to stockpile the jeans and bought several pairs of them. So the next time he did that, there was another batch that came in a couple of years later. The next time they did that, they gave out sort of certain amounts to factories, universities, and kind of institutions, and you had to bring your little ID card with you to basically get your one pair that you could then buy there. Even the Stasi got its own contingent of American jeans.
No way.
It just tells you a lot about how desirable they were, basically. And that's exactly why when the wall falls in 1989, you get this sort of stereotypical image of the East German kind of completely clad in denim.
There was a tash mullet and one-piece denim look.
That's the look.
That was particularly fine. But interestingly, there is a big music culture going on. There was something in the book you talk about, the Red Woodstock. Explain that to me, because there was a kind of a vibrancy in the 70s and into the 80s in East Germany that we were very unaware of.
Yeah, I mean, it's again something to do with Honecker's desire to usher in kind of a new era after Walter Ulbricht had been in charge for 2 decades, and it was very much, as we said, about stabilizing the GDR basically and creating an existence for it, and that obviously isn't particularly inspiring in the long run if that's all you got to offer as a state. You know, we still exist, and where do you take it from there? So Honecker's view was that you need to give people some of the things that they want, or else, you know, you have no kind of viable vision for the future. And so one of the things that he did was, when it was the GDR's time again to host, there was sort of like a socialist international youth festival, which I'm told is still going on, but I don't think on quite the same scale anymore. And when it was the GDR's time in East Berlin to host this again in 1973, he wanted it to be a huge, big and happy sort of festival. So yes, a few dissidents were locked up in advance because they kind of, you know, knew that there was going to be some sort of counter demonstration, and these people were sort of kept to the side. But other than that, it was remarkably open-minded and basically invited lots of people from the West over as well. So you had, for instance, an American contingent led by Angela Davis, the sort of infamous American...
Oh, the Black Panther. Yeah.
You know, so communist, and she was a big star in the GDR anyway, because there had been a huge campaign, a Free Angela campaign, basically, while she was in prison. So, you know, there was an excitement about people from all over the world coming to East Germany, to Berlin, and it was massive as well. There were 8 million people coming to it over the 10 days or so.
Wow.
in August 1973. It was huge. And, you know, you said as a you know, in the West is sometimes known as the Red Woodstock because of some of the debauchery that was going on there as well in Berlin. But, you know, by comparison, Woodstock had something like 20, 25,000. And so it's, you know, it was massive. You even had from West Germany youth groups coming over. So the Angela Merkel later, her Christian Democratic Party, they sent a youth contingent over. You know, these were like the cold warriors on the Western side, and they were curious about what's going on in the GDR and why it's suddenly so open. Or I quote a West German journalist on public TV who basically said maybe this isn't so stuffy after all.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so they kind of achieved for that moment, I think, in '73, and this is at the same time that they're building up the coffee thing in Vietnam, or thinking about it. But you had a sort of sense that maybe there is a sort of distinctly sort of East German vision for what the future could actually look like in a more open, more democratic type of socialism, which many younger people had kind of dreamt about.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because if you look at, for example, the amount of women in the workforce, you look at childcare, you look at, and you contrast that, and Germany would be miles ahead of us, West Germany, but it's also creating a very emancipated female population. So again, let's tease that out, because the figures are quite phenomenal.
Yeah, they are. So by the end in the 1980s, you basically had over 90% of East German women in employment, most of them full-time. That's the highest rate ever achieved at any point in human history, basically. And, you know, you could argue, of course, as people did, as an economic reason for that, since the GDR was always short of workers. But at the same time, it's an ideological thing as well. You know, when you look at International Women's Day, where that comes from in its socialist roots, there's a long history of the idea that you have the working mother basically as the ideal. You know, even during the Second World War in the Soviet Union, you had these posters of sort of Soviet women with the Kalashnikov in one hand and the baby in the other. So that was kind of the ideal, really. And by the 70s, they'd gone quite a long way to getting there with that. Because of the amount of childcare. So to give you one example, my mother was at university in Dresden studying there when I was born, and that was possible. She kind of carried on basically studying because of the childcare on campus, and because it was, as you said earlier,
childcare on campus.
There was childcare on campus, so you could kind of. She had a sort of mother-child accommodation where she lived, where you had sort of like an area, you know, for a cot and things like that. And then when she walked to the campus to listen to a lecture or whatever, she could literally drop me on the way in the childcare center, and then even as a baby, basically, and then go to her lecture, come back, pick me back up, and make that work. It was hard work, and many women will tell you that that this kind of double burden, as it's called, was immense on women. But again, the regime also was quite aware of that and tried to deal with that in different ways. So they were actively, for instance, promoting for men to take more of a role in sort of raising children, for example.
It wasn't happening in this country, I can tell you, in the 1970s.
It wasn't fully happening in the GDR either, because you still had that sort of old-fashioned view of what a family is and what the roles are. But nonetheless, it was moving in that direction. So I know that my own father took much more of a role in sort of raising me than was the case with West Germans that I know, because it just became more of a thing. They'd sort of feature fathers in interviews in the sort of press, you know, such as it was. Yeah. And they'd have sort of a household day, which wasn't, as many people sometimes call it, a housewife day, but a household day, which either of the two partners could take off once a month to kind of just deal with things in the household and just get stuff done, because it was understood that both partners by and large worked full time, and, you know, kind of running your own home at the same time, as everyone knows, isn't an easy thing to do. But it's funny,
because the household, I was looking at statistics in the book where, for example, on average, after tax, the rent for the average East German was 4% of their income, and the average West German was 28% of their income. So again, I mean, this is a society that is really quite family friendly, and is trying to reduce the anxiety, the daily anxiety of finance and money and all that sort of stuff.
I think that is the reason why you get a degree of nostalgia about this today in some sectors, particularly sort of working class families, where they say, you know, of course things weren't great in lots of ways, not least because, you know, supplies were always an issue. You couldn't always get the types of food or whatever that you wanted, or, you know, there was always only one type of everything, and all of that was an issue. But at the same time, these fundamental concerns that many people have today, you know, how do you get by on a month-by-month basis, they didn't really exist as such, because the rents were subsidized, because food was subsidized, because, you know, even education, anything basically that the state could kind of provide was there. And of course that model wasn't economically viable in the long run, because they were spending so much.
And they need to get the money from somewhere.
The money needed to come from somewhere, and you can do that if you have a state-run industry, because obviously the profits then don't go into the private sector but stay within the state. But at the same time, it doesn't generate as much either for various reasons. So basically that security, that sort of baseline security that was there, is something that I don't think people saw because it was normal at the time. But then once the Berlin Wall fell and you have high unemployment, and later in the 90s and in the early 2000s, the welfare state was cut back. At that point, many people felt that sort of safety net that they had in the GDR wasn't obviously there anymore. And that's something that people are sometimes nostalgic about.
So let's look at a very odd thing. I was saying before you came out that we went on this football trip to Berlin. And there was, I know it's very difficult for people who look at Dalkey now, but in the early 90s, there was a vibrant Dalkey punk movement, right? I know you might find this difficult, but the Dalkey punks were a thing. And we all looked up to the Dalkey punks. I wasn't allowed to be a punk. You know, when you go home, you're not allowed. So I always looked at the punks. But when we first went to East Germany, right, to Alexanderplatz, and we arrived in as Western, teenagers, the first thing we noticed were hundreds of punks. What we would call in Dublin scum punks, right? Big mohawks, the whole thing, which we only saw in the King's Road or Piccadilly in London. You never saw that in Dublin. And interestingly, my son, who studied German, has just finished, he did his dissertation on the punk movement in East Berlin. So what I want to ask is, there was a sort of a vibrant counterculture that you never hear about when you talk about the Stasi and Honecker and the dullness. There was an emergent counterculture in East Germany. There
was, yeah, and again, this is something that German intellectuals who were dissidents or opponents of the state also get strangely nostalgic about. So in a way, these kind of sort of niche cultures and the spaces that they had to find, they created communities because they were the kind of communities within the state that didn't really like them or want them there. I mean, it's kind of funny now looking back when you look at some of the Stasi records and even the types of delinquents that they sort of categorized, and had the drawings for. The punks feature in that quite heavily because the Stasi was totally worried about their sort of moral, the look and the sort of moral impact that they might have on young people. But even if you go a little bit further towards mainstream culture, you have, for instance, like artist communes in different places, and most famously on some of the Baltic islands, where entire sort of like hippie communes basically formed and were largely left to do that.
These are places like Rügen and these big islands up the north. I think these are big islands.
Yeah, exactly. And the state kind of thought, they're tucked away there, that they don't do any harm. Let them sit there and be different if they need to. But there was always, once again, the suspicion that this might feed back.
We did a version
society.
of that called the Screamers on Inish Boffin in the 1970s. People might remember them. But can we just come up to now? So now we see this very, very perceptible difference between East Germans and West Germans. And it's probably most explicitly expressed in voting patterns. How do you see this panning out?
Well, I think I just did a huge analysis on the European election results from last week, because they showed exactly that pattern. And obviously the German and international press were very quick to pick up on this really stark map. I mean, when you put it on there, basically in the East, in all of, apart from Berlin, but in all of the constituencies, the AfD on the far right came out top. And you look at the West, and the whole side of the western part of the country is black for the colours of the Conservatives. And that is something that, when you just look at it on the map, looks stark. But if you look, for example, at the social background of voters, you'll find that amongst workers, working class people, the AfD came out top across the country.
Across Germany.
Across the country.
And it's a fascist-leaning party?
It's a far-right party, but it is a party that hasn't quite got... The leadership certainly doesn't quite have a grip on where exactly it's going. So you have people who are outright neo-Nazis in it, all the way to sort of small C conservative people. They're all in the party at the moment, which makes it quite difficult to discern exactly why people vote for them and who votes for them. But I found the social element really interesting, because when you think East Germans only make up about 17% of the country now, and you look, across the board, 33% of working class people voted for the AfD, way ahead of all the other parties. That's a lot to do with the fact that East Germany was a society without, private property, effectively. So people didn't have, sort of large inheritances. The household, actual household wealth is half in the East compared to the West.
Half?
On average.
That's extraordinary.
So that's not the kind of day-to-day or month-by-month
No, but the
income,
inherited wealth and the
wealth
property
overall.
and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so people have less kind of security to fall back on, which means every time there's some sort of economic crisis, as we see now with inflation, it's extremely acutely felt in the East. And when you mention this to political parties, because a lot of them now want me to explain the East to them, and I always sit there and say the same thing.
This is a new industry. It's a new gig.
Pretty much is. And you mention these things to them, they just don't get it. They say, well, people aren't that badly off. You know, they're still doing better than they did in the day. And but that's not the point. The insecurity, the felt insecurity is much, much higher in the East because people can't sit there and say, I'm just going to sit out a few bad years because I can.
I've got an apartment I can sell or something like that. Yeah.
But if your rent's already sky high, you know, and you don't know whether it's going to get even higher next month, and you know, you go in the supermarket and suddenly your shopping costs 20% more. All of that is extremely, acutely felt in the East and creates an anxiety, and people don't feel that anxiety is taken seriously by the kind of mainstream parties, if you will.
It's fascinating because it's an inherited wealth notion that
that's part of this kind of divide, I find, that people lived very differently in the East, lived in a different system, and that those things don't suddenly disappear when when the wall came down, basically, and people are suddenly supposed to be West German, economically, politically, culturally, and it just doesn't work. And it's not an automatic process either. Quite often people say, 35 years have passed, why is it still not the same? Or they take economic metrics like, wages or whatever, and they are getting closer. But on other things, it's not going to automatically just be a case that East Germans just abandon the way that they are, basically, and become West German.
Well, it's funny, like you talk about 17 million. I mean, that's, 3 and a bit times the population of this country. So it's a significant amount of people who are living in Germany feeling slightly semi-detached from the main thing. I think, this is fascinating stuff. I absolutely love talking about this stuff. Katja Hoyer, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks.